Now, if you've been here the last few Sundays that I was here, we in our Sunday morning service have been pulling little lessons out of Jeremiah. And so today we are going to look at another one that will have to do with events that take place in Jeremiah chapter 37 and chapter 38. So if you got your Bibles with you, you can go ahead and turn there. But before we get started, the last time I was with you, we talked about rising above discouragement and how Jeremiah did that. Despite all odds, he rose above discouragement. And there was plenty of it around him. This lesson is going to be about persevering with obedience, or persevering in obedience. Walter Payton, quick little story here real quick before we get started. Walter Payton played for 13 years for the Chicago Bears. He was their running back. And during his career, he rushed over 9 miles. It was about 16,726 yards. Now, that's interesting. That's fascinating. And I couldn't imagine having that as one of my accomplishments. But what makes that number even more interesting and spectacular is he achieved it with someone knocking him down about an average of every 4.6 yards. So, talk about getting knocked down, getting back up. And any of us know that when we get knocked down, it's hard to get back up. It's just a hard process for us to understand. And Jeremiah, too, was a man who kept getting knocked down for what he believed in, for what he was preaching. Jeremiah had faithfully proclaimed God's message of the coming destruction of Judah for 40 years now. Now, all of his warnings and predictions were coming true. Babylon had laid siege to Jerusalem. I'm sorry, I've got something in my eye. Oh, wow. I'm sorry. It's an eyelash or something. I can see it. I apologize. Babylon had laid siege to Jerusalem, and the fall of the city was imminent. And you would think that after proclaiming this message for some 40 years, that the people would eventually start to believe Jeremiah. Because at this very moment, the Babylonians were surrounding the city and laying siege to it. And you would think that out of all the warnings that Jeremiah gave, this would be the eye-opener. But it wasn't. It still wasn't enough. You see, Jeremiah's message only made the people more and more angry. And they hated him more and more he preached. They kept taking shots at him. They kept knocking him down. They kept beating him up, leaving him for dead, putting him in prison. But Jeremiah, every single time, would get up despite what they thought he would do. He prevailed despite suffering to be faithful to what God wanted him to do. Jeremiah was a great example of persevering in obedience. So how does he do that? In what instances do we see Jeremiah getting knocked down and getting back up? Well, Jeremiah, first we see that he was arrested for deserting to the enemy. Now it's kind of it's an interesting story here when you read about it in chapter 37. Basically what happens is, at one point during the siege, the Babylonian forces are withdrawing. And as they're withdrawing, Jeremiah has the idea that he wants to go to the land of Benjamin to claim his portion there among the people. It says that in chapter 37, verse 12. Now, some have kind of tried to figure out why did he try to leave Jerusalem? Out of all talk about bad timing, why did he choose them? And many believe that it had to do with a field purchase he made in chapter 32. Basically, he bought some land, and so the argument here is that he was actually just going to go check on his property, property that he had paid for. But even if that was the purpose, he doesn't get very far. Because as he's leaving the city, the sentry who was posted at watch there arrested Jeremiah and charges him with treason and accuses him of defecting to the enemy or wanting to go with them. And so But can you imagine that accusation coming your way? Imagine you're Jeremiah and all you have done for 40 years is preach to the people that God's wrath and judgment was coming upon them. And if they didn't change their ways, the judgment and wrath of God would be completed. It was going to take place. And to be called a traitor. He was trying to save them as much as he possibly could. And yet they arrest him and charge him with treason. Imagine that being you. How would you have felt? Now, obviously, the accusation would not have made Jeremiah very happy. But he had been loyal to his country. He had been loyal to the people. He had stood strong and he voiced the truth no matter what consequences they would throw at him. It didn't stop him. But they refused. They became so acquainted with the darkness, they preferred it over the light. And that's where they were in this particular situation. So they bring him to the city officials. The guard brings Jeremiah to the city officials, who then take Jeremiah to the king. And basically he gets beat up and thrown in prison. And he stays there for a few days. And then King Zedekiah, who was king of Judah at that time, reigning in Jerusalem, calls for Jeremiah. And do you remember why he wanted Jeremiah out of prison? He wanted to find out if God had anything to say. You just threw his prophet, his messenger, into prison. And now you want to know if God has anything to say. And the message that Jeremiah would bring to Zedekiah was not good for Zedekiah. It made him so... Zedekiah was not a very strong king, understand that. A lot of the things that Zedekiah did as far as his actions, and especially with Jeremiah, was very, very weak and cowardly. I would categorize them. Not trying to be too harsh on King Zedekiah, but he definitely didn't stand up for what was right. He didn't stand true to his convictions like Jeremiah did. So Jeremiah comes from the prison, chapter 37, verse 17. He comes to the king and he said, there is something that God wants to say. And he says, you will be handed over to the Babylonians. That's not what King Zedekiah wanted to hear. But it was the truth. I can only imagine King Zedekiah's feeling in his heart when Jeremiah told him those words. Perhaps he felt a feeling of dread and despair. I don't know. But considering his circumstances, at any moment Jeremiah could have gave up. He could have just stayed down, but he couldn't do it. Because the message that God had instilled in Jeremiah's heart and on his mind was burning too hot to extinguish. And instead, he would get back up and boldly proclaim the truth and continue to do so, despite other things that are going to happen. So not only was he arrested for deserting to the enemy, which was a false charge, but he was also accused of demoralizing the army. Basically, he gives this not so hyped up pep talk to the, and as a result, the people's spirits are quite diminished. Their morale is depleted. And especially the soldiers and the commanders, their spirits are flattened. And so as a result, the city officials accuse him of demoralizing their army. Those who were going to protect them from the Babylonians, because all these wise men that King Zedekiah had at his right and left hand told him, we're going to be okay. Judah will win this. Babylon doesn't stand a chance. That's all he kept hearing, King Zedekiah. But that wasn't the truth. The opposite was true. That Jerusalem would fall. That Babylon would invade time and time again. People would die. People would be taken prisoner. People would be sold into slavery. You can almost imagine a coach before the big game, before the big championship game. Can you imagine if a coach just walked in and said, guys, you're going to get destroyed out there? That coach probably doesn't need to be a coach. Wouldn't you agree? But that's pretty much the talk Jeremiah gave. He wasn't preaching a sermon of prosperity or mercy. He was preaching a sermon of God's judgment. And so the officials, again, get angry. And they want to kill Jeremiah. And so as a result, the city officials bring Jeremiah to King Zedekiah. Once again. You gotta wonder how annoyed King Zedekiah was, not just at maybe the officials, but also Jeremiah. I don't know. But probably for both. But the king wouldn't kill Jeremiah. That's what they wanted. But he not only wouldn't kill Jeremiah, which is good, don't get me wrong, but he also wouldn't do anything else to stop the city officials from persecuting Jeremiah as much as they were. And so in chapter 38, verse 6, tells us that they take things into their own hands. Since Zedekiah is not going to do anything, they take Jeremiah and they throw him into this cistern, which was almost like a well. And you would have had an opening at the top, and then it basically went underground. It was carved out of rock, and it basically makes this pear shape. And at the bottom, it either squares out or it rounds out. And they were used to collect rainwater during the wet season, and then during the dry season, they had water. They throw him in one of these things. But there was no water in there. Chapter 38, verse 6 tells us that there was only mud. And it says that Jeremiah sank in the mud. And if anybody knows what wet mud smells like over time, it is awful, ain't it? Everybody's like, yep, I know what that smells like. It's terrible. And here he is in this cistern, basically waiting to die because they weren't going to get him out. They wanted him to die. They were hoping that would do the trick. But eventually he gets pulled out of there. But the point is that his message was not popular. And it was not agreed upon in unison. And neither was he popular. Like I said, the people wanted a sermon of mercy, not of justice. They wanted God to simply turn his head the other direction at their sin and at their lifestyle that they had chose to live away from God. They didn't want a God, or Jeremiah, to talk about a God who was who was going to punish their sin. But Jeremiah spoke the truth. And he wouldn't allow the threats or the mean stares or whatever get him down. And we all know that the truth is hard to hear. We all know that not only is the truth sometimes really hard to give to people, to deliver, but it's really hard to receive it. Sometimes the truth causes people to get so angry they want to pounce on the one bringing the truth to them. We see that all the time. But what an awful way to go for Jeremiah, who was simply doing everything God had told him to do in proclaiming the truth. He was obedient. He was faithful. And after his rescue from the cistern, he brings this message to the king. Because the king sends for Jeremiah because, you know what? He wants to know once again, does God have anything to say for me, for us? Well, Jeremiah's got to be wondering, really? Because the last time you called for me, I got in trouble. And now you want to call me again. You didn't like the first news I brought. What makes you think you're going to like the second round of news? And so he tells King Zedekiah this is an interesting sentence here. So he was hoping, Zedekiah was hoping that Jeremiah's prophecy was going to be very favorable, because everyone else around Zedekiah was telling him, Jerusalem's going to win. You know, we're going to overtake the Babylonians, no problem. But Jeremiah was preaching the opposite. And so when he asked Jeremiah to present to him words from God, basically, Jeremiah tells him in verse 15, he said, if I tell you, you will kill me, won't you? And then he says, besides, if I give you advice, you won't listen anyway. Well, that's one way to talk to the king. He said, if I tell you what needs to be said, you're not going to like it. Just a heads up. And so, of course, the king promises he won't take his life. He's going to be okay. He'll spare him. And so Jeremiah tells him. He hid nothing back from Zedekiah. And he told Zedekiah, he said, if you surrender to Babylon, you, your family, the city, the people will be spared. But if you don't surrender, that is not a guarantee. And of course, we see it in Scripture and we see it throughout history that they refused to surrender. Jeremiah hid nothing back from the king, the city officials, the guards, the troops. It didn't matter who you were, he didn't hold back. One would say that Jeremiah ran a race of integrity, carried the ball without fumbling, and look what he got in return. Not a whole lot of good, right? Jeremiah was an exemplary, was an exceptional example of a man doing as God commands and instructs, with such integrity and such faithfulness. But what does he get in return as he does these things? He gets beat up. He gets locked in stocks. He gets locked in prisons. He gets thrown in a cistern that's full of mud and death threats. Over and over again, he gets knocked down, and he continually gets back up. All for the truth. Jeremiah's story reminds us some of the story of Jesus. I think in a lot of different ways, but we'll talk about it in just a second. He too was a prophet. He said in Luke 4:24, he actually said, I assure you, no prophet's accepted in his hometown. Jeremiah was feeling that. He wasn't accepted in his hometown. And though popular at first, Jesus saw the tide of public opinion turn against him. He proclaimed a message of grace, but also of justice. He was not accepted by all. He encountered death threats as well. He was misunderstood. He was called names. He was knocked down again and again, even to the point of walking his cross to the location where he would be crucified. But obedience drove him to do it. Perseverance in obedience drove himself to subject himself to the will of the Father, to bear the truth. And his obedience was put to the ultimate test, and he perfectly met it. He too ran for the glory and won, for sure. So what does it mean to persevere in obedience? I think there's a lot of different ways that we can look at this, and there's probably more than what I've got here. So if you think of something, I would be interested to hear it. But throughout Jeremiah's ordeal, he stood by his convictions. Do you stand by your convictions? Speaking the truth of God's will. Jeremiah 1:18, Jeremiah is described as, he needs to be like that iron pillar and those bronze walls, right? He needs to be an example to others. And yeah, Jeremiah was a man of unfaltering conviction. He sure was. Jesus likewise would be the same way. He was not going to be distracted from his mission to seek and save the lost, as Luke 19:10 tells us. And a person with convictions, strong convictions, know what they believe, they know where they're going, they know why. Convictions aren't forced on an individual, they're beliefs and actions of choice. They're the truth, the mission, the calling given by God that is not altered by time, people, opinions, or circumstances. Francis Kelly wrote that convictions are the mainsprings of action, the driving powers of life. And what a man lives are his convictions. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. would actually tell his children often that if a man has nothing that is worth dying for, he is not fit to live. Each day will challenge our convictions on what to do that is right or wrong. And every day we have to make choices based on our convictions, which is what we're going to talk about now. But the person who perseveres in obedience does so by standing true to their convictions. Number one. Number two, making the right choices. And that's not always easy to do. Neither is standing by your convictions. People who persevere choose not to stay down. They get up. The choices that we make yesterday affect our today, and the choices we make today affect our tomorrow. Right? If I didn't prepare this lesson this morning, and I just woke up this morning and I said, well, I'll figure something out. Number one, never would I do that. I would not be able to do it. But how would you feel? If all I was doing up here was stuttering and babbling about nonsense that I know nothing about, haven't studied on, haven't researched, haven't looked at. So the choices we make, one person actually said, we are our choices. And in some sense that's true. But obedience is always a choice, right? We choose to obey or not. We choose to answer the call or ignore the call. No one forces us to do that. No one is forcing you to be here. I don't think so. Nobody is forcing you to obey God or His will. It boils down to the choices you make each and every day. A choice to obey or not. A choice to be faithful or not. A choice to be loving or not. To be merciful, forgiving, to be available or not. The choices that determine our obedience are the ones that regard our honesty and our integrity and our sincerity. Spouses, remaining faithful to your spouses, to each other. For students, you got two choices for that upcoming test. Well, it's summertime, but you got an upcoming test coming up. Well, you can do one of two things. You can either study hard, or you can get the answers elsewhere, or by other means. Not so good means. But we make these choices every day. Whether it's at home, in our workplace, at our schools, out in the store, wherever it may be. Doug Sherman and William Hendricks wrote a book, To Succeed Where It Really Counts, How to Succeed Where It Really Counts. They tell this story about these two friends that had this extremely profitable business. And they put it up for sale, and immediately they get a buyer. And the buyer wants to buy the business for pretty much the price they're asking for, which is great. So they make their decision on a Friday. They pretty much don't have any paperwork done. They just tell the buyer, hey, we'll sign the papers Monday, we'll be good to go. We'll continue the transaction. Over the weekend, they got a call. They received another offer. And this offer was enormously higher. It would have been a much higher profit that they would have netted had they went with this second person. And unsure of what to do, they spent basically the whole weekend just praying, asking God, what do we do here? We kind of know what the right answer is, but we need guidance here. We need to make sure this is what we need to do. Is there anything wrong with going with this second person's offer and refusing the first, even though we told them? And by the end of the weekend, they made their decision that they would call the second buyer and turn them down. The one that had offered that enormously much higher profit or purchase. But they made their decision on what they believed was the right thing to do. They could have chose the opposite and been a whole lot richer. But that wasn't how they valued their integrity. That wasn't how they valued their convictions through dollars. It was much more than that to them. Maintaining personal character is another way we do this. Persevering in obedience is maintaining our personal character. Jeremiah maintained his character. He stood on the truth of God's word in the midst of people preaching a whole different message. Or at least wanted him to preach a whole different message. But his character, no matter what, remained intact. Even in those moments where he was down at the bottom of a pit, literally, at some point. And the most pressing need in our world today, I don't think anybody here would disagree with me, is people clothing themselves with Christ and having that Christ-like character example wherever we go. The world needs that now more than ever. And unfortunately, it's a trait that sometimes seems like it's in short supply. Gail Shee, who in her book, Character, America's Search for Leadership, she said the root of the word character is the Greek word for engraving. As applied to humans, it refers to the enduring marks left by life that set one apart as an individual. In other words, character is that encompassing ingredient in life that makes us different. Maintaining personal character and refusal to compromise. Now, granted, there are circumstances that call for compromise to maintain peace and harmony. We see that on a global scale all the time. But we should not ever, ever, ever compromise the truth. That is the one thing that we do not need to do. Jeremiah did not compromise with the sentry who arrested him for treason. Didn't really try to even argue with the guy. He didn't, nor with the officials who wanted Jeremiah to soften his message. He could have told the officials of the city, okay, I'll tone it down a bit. Or okay, I'll start preaching this message that you guys want me to preach that everything's going to be fine. Okay. He could have done that. He could have compromised that way. But if he'd done that, he would have been compromising the truth. And that's not something he could easily do. That message was too hot in his bones and in his soul for him to do that. So he did. He stuck to God's plan. He stuck to the message that was in his heart, that God had put there. He refused to back down or compromise the truth. He didn't compromise with King Zedekiah. Christian history is filled with inspiring stories. I want to share this with you real quick. Filled with inspiring stories featuring people with principle, those who are immortalized for refusing to compromise their beliefs. In 1660, England's experiment as a republic came to an abrupt end when they returned back to monarchist rule under Charles II. And with this change, religious freedom also came to a halt. And then, of course, you had the Church of England, and that was where you received your word and nowhere else. And if you were caught preaching on the streets or anywhere else, and you didn't have the proper certification or documentation, guess what? You got arrested. But there was a compromise. And the rule was that if you were arrested, as long as you agreed to stop, then you would be released. Everything would be fine. Or you would, not have to serve your term or your time in prison. And so what's really interesting about this is there was a man, his name was John Bunyan, not Paul Bunyan, as the story goes. We're not talking about Paul Bunyan. John Bunyan was arrested for preaching without proper certification in England. And so his growing popularity, though, he was so popular that the judge wanted to seek some kind of compromise. And so he tells him, he says, I tell you what, I'll let you go as long as you agree that you will not continue to preach without proper certification from the Church of England, basically. That's where you obtain that. And his famous words were, if you release me today, I'll preach tomorrow. So 3 times in his life, he was arrested for the very same thing. Preaching without a license, basically. In the end, he actually spent an accumulated time of 12 years in prison. And at any of those times, he could have just gave up. And he could have said, you know what, I'm done going to prison every few years. I don't know what else I'm supposed to do here. But he never did it. He never compromised the truth. He never compromised his convictions. And he adamantly refused to do so, even to those who were the leaders of that area. And so those prison years were not certainly, they weren't wasted. It was actually during that time that he wrote his book, Pilgrim's Progress, which actually became very popular. It's now a Christian classic. But even today, and I know it's not something that we really see here all that much, but there are people in other parts of the world, Christians, children of God, your brothers and sisters, that are sitting in a jail cell simply for what they believe, simply for their convictions, for the truth. Not because they tried to rob someone or take someone's life, but preaching the gospel or sharing it with others. There are places in the world that consider them things crimes. In Laos, Christianity is thought to be an American religion. How they derive that, I don't know. Christianity sure didn't spawn here in the United States of America. But because it's so much of a Western-type religion to them, they forbid it preached. And those that do so get thrown in prison. And believe it or not, their rule is the same as King Zedekiah. As long as you agree to not do what you're doing, we'll let you go. You can live your life. You'll be fine. Some refuse and some don't. And compromise, like I said, is not always bad. Sometimes we have to compromise to maintain peace and harmony. But when it comes to issues of our faith, we are expected to stand. We're expected to stand for Christ and His principles that He has passed on to us, His attributes that He wants us to copy and to share with others. And so, my question this morning is, when you get knocked down repeatedly, what do you do? Do you get back up? Do you continue to run that race? Or do you stay down? Do you compromise your convictions? Do you compromise making the right choices? Do you compromise the truth? I want to encourage you this morning to stand for the truth.